Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is SerCypher here with a 1v1 ladder match I played a week or so ago. And everybody in the thread has been hitting on the Brits, and also in that 2v2 match I had with showed with Buff Butler and Sweet COH Girl 93, I kept talking about the British player being Royal Artillery, and oh, they should build 25 pounder, they should build 25 pounder. But I didn't really explain why 25 pounders are especially good as Royal Artillery, and also what sort of options that gives the British player. So I thought I'd show this video in which I pick Royal Artillery and try and utilize it to its fullest. So I'm starting here. I 100% of the time go Lieutenant first for the British. I never get infantry section or a Brent carrier first. The German player, interestingly, went 3 squads of engineers, or 3 squads of pioneers. They had 1 build the building, and they have 2 going out to cap points. The reason I never build, I always build a lieutenant first, is because if you build a Brent carrier first, you only have 1 squad that can cap. And if you build a infantry section first, British units move at 50% speed in enemy territory and 75% speed in neutral territory. So your units are going to be moving very slowly to capture points. The recon section doesn't have that problem, so that's one thing, but also the lieutenant doesn't have that problem. So I normally just use that and have the lieutenant go capture points on his own. Now the German player, they're building out of their wearmount quarters a heavy machine gun, and essentially the standard thing to do, especially if you're the German player, if you're the wear player and you're in the bottom, is to put a heavy machine gun into this church. And you're almost stupid if you don't, because the church obviously is a very large, imposing building. It's got lots of windows. You could turn it into a forward barracks. It's a very excellent place to capture. So I moved down here, and then I had planned to build a mortar pit right here behind this house, because I assumed that the enemy was going to put a machine gun into this church, what they did. But what I forgot is, because I hadn't played for a little bit, is that if your command truck is moving, just for the record, if you're a British player, if your command truck's moving, you don't get any resources from any of your points. And also, you can't build any emplacements. So I couldn't build a mortar pit, so I had to head down here and just cap points instead. For the record, though, I think you saw it drove through this wall. The command truck does have at least light crush, so the command truck can drive through walls. So occasionally, you might even have to make use of that. But I decided my original plan was to set up over here behind this house, but I don't feel comfortable doing that without a mortar emplacement to protect my command truck, so I decided to set it up here.
Germans are attacking our supply lines.
You see how slowly this infantry section is moving in neutral territory, and that's why, for the most part, there's no point in building infantry sections to capture points early on. Most of your points are going to get captured early on by your lieutenant and your recon section. So I chase him away from this point. The German player builds 2 machine gun, builds a machine gun, and also 2 motorcycles. Which are not a bad choice, because if you have a machine gun and you suppress or you pin the enemy with the machine guns, you can cruise in there with the motorcycles and finish them off. But mostly he just has pioneers. He wires off this area, and he is just trying to do a lot of capping. But obviously pioneers can't stop an infantry section. So I start building a mortar pit, which I should have done long time ago. And he's building now Volksgrenadiers to give him a little bit more aggressiveness on the map.
Ready, sir. Build study for further orders.
So as things stand, something that's sort of crucial is that he has 2 victory points, and that I only have, and I have 0. So almost every second I'm losing a victory point. You're seeing it's going down about every, I think the victory points tick every 3 seconds. But obviously that's a problem. So anyway, he realizes now I have this mortar emplacement, and he comes over here to deal with it with these motorcycles. And you see, although the mortar emplacement is fairly resistant to small arms fire, it is getting damaged by these machine guns. So I head over here to chase off these motorcycles, but at the same time he runs his machine gun back into the church, and that pins both of my infantry units. At the same time, I'm still over here capping points. Something I like to do is when I'm about to advance on an area, I'll build a trench a little bit back, so if I run into something bad, I can just run back and hop into the trench. Anyway, my guys are pinned, but I do have the mortar, and I'm using that to deal some damage. The enemy puts another machine gun in this house, which now isn't going to allow them to even pin my guys next to this mortar pit, which is obviously a problem. But I have gone a little bit ahead of the power curve, and I have already gotten my second command truck, which is going to allow me to build sappers. The enemy is still on tier 1, and they haven't built a for some reason I can't remember the name of the building, but the building that lets them buy veterancy. So I had to abandon the mortar pit, and I decide that since it looks like there's going to be a lot of fighting in the center,
An ammo storage
I really
facility
need
is
to
being
build
overrun.
this casualty clearing station. Same time I'm getting rifle grenades on this squad over here, and this whole time the victory point counter is ticking down.
NCO's reporting they have destroyed a German target.
So the enemy now is building their tier 2 building, the Krieg barracks, and they are sending troops over here to now deal with my encroachment from the north. So I try and advance over here again. At the same time, I've got sappers. The German player is building more Volksgrenadiers from their Wehrmacht quarters. I think they feel like they've got the middle pretty locked down. They've got a machine gunner there. They have another machine gunner. I'm actually not sure where they... Okay, they have another machine gunner just kind of chilling. And my attack fails and I have to back off again. But I built 2 squads of sappers. I'm building the lieutenant now. And the German player starts building an AT gun, which is a pretty smart choice because the British can get tanks pretty early. You can get a Stuart out on the field pretty fast. So it's wise to have something to deal with that. I finally come over here to capture this victory point, so I won't be bleeding victory points to the enemy at such a high rate, but again, I don't really have any way of taking this middle map, this middle victory point. I'm going to try and move in here again, but this machine gun here with this window has a really good arc of fire, and it pins my guys almost immediately. But at the same time, I'm sending guys down here to try and take the enemy's victory points away. So I do have rifle grenades though, so obviously you can see if the enemy stays behind cover, it doesn't really help them. But he sets his machine gun here now, and that pins all my guys, and so I have to back off again. It's at this point that I'm getting pretty worried. Obviously, I don't really have anything to deal with this center point, and the enemy seems pretty content to try and win off of victory points. Now, for the record, sometimes people put machine guns in this house like this guy does. This house is not a very good place to put a machine gun if you're trying to shoot down this road, because as you can see, it doesn't really have any good windows that can shoot down the road. This is the closest one. You can put one down there, but it's just not really at a good angle. You see there, that guy just put the machine gun there, just got sniped by my steward that just arrived on the field. But the enemy's one step ahead of me, and they have an AT gun somewhere. They have the AT gun here in this road. Now, AT guns, while they're a pretty good defensive measure, an AT gun by itself is not a good defense against a tank, especially a light tank, because the tank can just drive around it. It's best if you have your AT gun, and your AT gun is backed up by anti-tank infantry. So if the enemy tries to get close to the AT gun, the anti-tank infantry will just blast it. He just spent munitions there to shoot my steward twice with Panzer Shreks. So that's how it got hurt. So I recap their AT gun, but for some reason I don't move it. I just leave it here. And so obviously that's not good. And that also, since it takes 3 crew members, robs my rifle grenade squad of two guys, when they could have probably taken out this house. And again, this whole time, the victory point ticker keeps ticking down. I'm calling in my 3rd command truck. The German players still on tier 2, but they seem to be doing rather well for themselves. Now, my thoughts at this point were, how am I going to get into the middle? And so I choose Royal Artillery because the first upgrade on one of the sides of the Royal Artillery line is supercharged artillery rounds, which means your artillery shoots fast or further. And that's all your artillery. That's mortars, that's 25-pounders, and that's self-propelled artillery. So normally a mortar would not be able to shoot this far, but I built a mortar here, and it's going to be able to cover most of the town with the supercharged rounds. Unfortunately, though, this is a pretty poor place to put it, and it's basically out in the open.
Mortar primed to fire. Let me at 'em.
The British casualty clearing station, you'll see that only sometimes the little red cross sort of symbol will appear. You have to spend munitions. It costs 40 munitions to heal the units around it. and it heals for, I forget how long, but it's enough to heal any infantry up to full, as long as they're there. But obviously, that's not quite as good as the American casualty, the American triage center, which always heals all units around it. But it sort of makes up for the fact that it also functions like a medic bunker, and that it recovers your wounded units. The enemy is taking advantage of the fact that I've had to retreat here, and they're capturing all these points. And yeah, they blow up my mortar pit, and now they have 2 AT guns here. I decide, okay, well, if I can't get a mortar pit there, I mean, they can't shoot all the way across the river here. And I also built a 25 pounder.
Gun crew here. Infantry closing in on us.
We're losing a strategic location.
Which does a lot of AoE, and is going to be backed up by this mortar pit I'm putting across the river. So I take out that AT gun. They have a second AT gun here, which I didn't know about. But again, if you don't have any sort of AT infantry to back up your AT gun, a tank can just kite it. You see that every time he tries to drive around, I just drive the other direction. And just by itself, it can't really stop a determined somebody's gonna micro a tank. Now it gets a little bit more difficult though, because now he has Panzerschreck infantry. But I guess they bug out somehow. You could see the guy get out his Panzerschreck, his silhouette, but somehow he didn't actually shoot it.
Ready for orders.
But I'm getting pretty worried at this point, because the thing just keeps ticking down. And then the enemy goes to capture my only strategic point, which is even only gonna make it tick down even faster. So the enemy knows that my mortar can get close to this house, so he retreats his machine gun, so it won't get killed by it. Crucially though, the enemy is still only on tier 2. And if I remember correctly, yeah, the enemy is floating lots of fuel, because since they didn't build the building that gives them veterancy, they don't have anything to spend it on. I'm floating a lot of fuel too, but I'm calling in now 25 pounder barrages to deal with these built up enemies. You can see those AoEs do a lot of damage, but I'm still forced to back off from this machine gun fire. So I decide that I at least need to get back one strategic point, so that I won't be bleeding manpower so quickly, or bleeding victory points so quickly. And the Stuart is not always super great against infantry, but it's resistant to the small arms fire. But Volksgrenadiers, crucially, if they spend enough munitions, can blow it up with their Panzerschreck ability. So they blow up my my Stuart.
Go ahead, sir. Number 1, make
But
ready.
at the same time, I'm just calling in more artillery barrages in the middle, hoping to get a couple kills. But this machine gunner is very lucky, and he seems to not want to get hit by anything.
COs have what they need to call in artillery.
Section ready. Finish up the victory point.
And this is an important thing for the British. I mean, obviously, if all your stuff gets blown up, you want to give up, but you never want to give up. The British, I feel, more than even a lot of factions, are very resilient, and that because they have so many weird little abilities and units, you never want to say the game's over. You know, there's always a chance that you can come back. So even though it's 500 to 90. I was still trying to figure out a way to get back
Troop gunfire orders.
into this game.
Munitions depot is being overrun.
Upgrade complete.
Not sure what this AT gun's shooting at. So I have my infantry sections, even though they're moving really slow. Fight against the enemy here, because infantry sections are still pretty tough dudes, and I have this infantry section heading down here to cap this point. Just like I said, never give up, as really as any faction. You also never want to get complacent. You can tell this enemy, I'm not sure how he's managing to spend all his money, but he gets rather complacent. He stops teching up. He has lots of AT guns and machine guns, mortars, all that stuff, but he basically assumes that, he basically decides he doesn't need to tech out because the game's almost over, really. But I built another 25 pounder here. I have my mortar pit here. And I actually set my 25 pounder over here on Overwatch Barrage, and instead of setting it in an area where I think they're going to attack, I walk over here and reveal where the enemy is, and then I set the Overwatch Artillery on the enemy position, which means that the Overwatch Artillery is going to keep shooting as long as it sees enemies. So as long as there's enemies in this area and I have vision of it, you see it stopped shooting right now because I don't have vision anymore. I think there's a couple more coming from when I still did have vision. But, you know, that killed about 4 units in, you know, about 10 seconds. So that's a pretty good trick, is to use Overwatch Artillery offensively. You figure out if the enemy is fortified an area, instead of calling an artillery strike on it, you just attack it, and then while you're attacking it, you call in Overwatch Artillery on the enemy. My other 25 pounder is just doing a normal artillery strike, and just blasting this church apart, which is only going to make it easier for me to attack. Again, though, the enemy has machine guns here, but British lieutenants who are at least Veterancy 1 have the same sort of fire up ability that airborne and rangers have, but they can use it on everyone around them. So when they use it, it'll break suppression all these around them, as you see I just do here. And also, if you're Royal Artillery, your lieutenants can call in off-map artillery strikes, which I do here, which takes care of most of these guys. And at the same time, I have this squad still moving up here. So because the enemy basically didn't do anything, they just put lots of machine guns and mortars, they didn't really have any way to deal with my my artillery. At the same time, I built a Cromwell here. This is one of those units, I'll have to do a video on at some point, that you have a choice before you start the game of picking either a Cromwell or a Kangaroo APC. I basically always pick the Cromwell. The other British unit that you have a choice on is you can get a Staghound or you can get a command tank. And normally I pick the Staghound. The enemy counterattacks here. But again, I still have Overwatch Artillery. So anybody who comes over here is gonna get blasted. And now I also have my stag hound. In response to this, the enemy starts blowing the Panzer Command, which is their best building. So you know, they're aware now that this is a problem they need to deal with. Again, though, I was at 34 victory points. If the game had gone on how it was for maybe about another 30 seconds, I would have lost. But now I have all three victory points, and now the timer's going in the other direction. So this is my stag hound. The reason I built the stag hound is for the British. There's certain parts where you can't build units until you get a specific unit. For example, you can't build the Stuart tank out of the support command vehicle, the field support truck, until you build a captain. And in the same way, you can't build the Firefly Sherman, which is pretty much the best tank you have, until you build these either a stag hound or a command tank. The Cromwell is basically just the standard. I mean, there's no really such thing as a standard tank, but it's pretty similar to either the Panzer IV or the Sherman. It's just a standard, well-armored tank with a 75mm gun. So about as good as a stock Sherman, although you can't put a 50 cal on it, or a stock Panzer IV.
Send your message over.
Now, I don't feel like I can attack the enemy's base, so I just keep capping points. You see the enemy here is putting an observation post on this fuel point. I'm not sure why, actually. They have 300 fuel. I feel like they probably have enough fuel at this point. They probably need more manpower than anything else. Because there's nothing stopping them from building a Panzer IV or a Tiger except manpower. Again, I'm trying not to repeat the same mistakes my opponent made. I'm digging trenches. I'm bringing up more units. I'm getting better tanks. But my opponent here, he decides, and actually this was actually a pretty smart move. Although I would have probably put it behind this wall so he'd get some cover. He builds an 88 on this side of the river. And 88s are only essentially, I mean, they do have a max range, but for the most part they're limited by line of sight. So they can shoot almost anywhere that they can see. This 88 can cover this road, it can cover that strategic point, it can even cover part of the town. And you see as soon as it finishes, it has line of sight of this infantry section that I sent to capture this middle point. And it calls an artillery. And it's shooting at them. But in response, I call in a 25-pounder barrage on it and kill the crew almost immediately. My plan was that I would capture this point, and since I already have this point, I would just call an Overwatch Artillery on this bridge and this bridge, and I guess, yeah, the enemy could come over here, but for the most part, nothing could come across these bridges without getting destroyed. But the fact that the enemy built this 88 here and they keep recruiting it obviously is a thorn in my side.
Germans are now at 300 points.
Because the 88... The reason it's not shooting right now is because that the reason it could see me before is because they had ownership of this point, but once I took it back, they lost vision of it.
We are losing a strategic sector.
So I'm digging trenches here. Digging trench there, digging trenches here. Keeping a couple guys out of the trenches just so I can be a little bit mobile. But I really love trenches. I did end up calling it Overwatch Artillery right here. But I have to run away, so I can't recapture that point. He said most British players seem to be kind of on the fence about trenches, but I love trenches. I build them all over the place. And they're really the only emplacement I do build all over the place. I almost never build Vickers guns. Sometimes I build 17-pounders and Bofors guns. I build mortar pits sometimes, but nothing to the extent where I build trenches.
3rd Battalion's just received access to self-propelled.
So I'm calling in more artillery on this area. I think that was actually a walking artillery I called in here. There's a special ability your artillery get is Royal Artillery for 150 munitions, and it's called walking artillery. And you call it in, and it's basically a line, and you set the direction of the line, and it calls in I think 15 artillery rounds, so that's almost 3 times the normal round. A normal artillery barrage is 6. The walking artillery has I think 15 rounds, and it starts at one area and it goes and it shoots all the way down the line, and it's pretty effective. Especially if you can call in multiples of them, because again there's a lot higher artillery density than normal. I try and take this point back, but he's got MP Volks, he's got an 88. I do still have Overwatch Artillery on this location, but it's not going to be enough.
Enemy unit destroyed.
Kills halls my recon section, but the Overwatch Artillery is still coming in. Overwatch Artillery shoots 3 rounds, normally speaking. So even if your artillery only sees them for a second, it's still normally going to shoot 3 rounds. So I've got guys in trenches here, so the enemy has to back off. And I also called in, I think, a walking barrage on them again. So you see it starts here, and it keeps heading this direction. And unlike the Overwatch barrage, there's no way the enemy knows, except if they see how big it is, that this walking barrage is coming. It's not just a normal barrage. So a lot of times the enemy can get caught up in it, because the normal barrage only covers about this area, but a walking barrage, you see it started here and it went about to here. It covers a lot more area. But anyway, now I have a Firefly, which is basically the premier British anti-tank tank. I've got my Cromwell. I've got guys in trenches. And then I call in a Priest, which you saw in that 2v2 with Buff Butler. It's similar to a 25-pounder. But it's basically an American 105, the same thing that the American 105s can build, but it's in a self-propelled thing. So it has a larger explosion than a 25-pounder. It does a little bit more damage. But other than that, it's basically the same.
German forces are bending. Victory is at
I'm not sure how many millimeters a 25-pounder translates to. I'll have to look that up. But the Priest is actually, it's a Sherman tank with a 105 howitzer in it.
Prepare the 105.
What the hell? They've zeroed in on us!
And I hear it go trying to capture this point once again. But now the enemy has built a Panther. And they're trying to attack with that. And you can see this 88 can shoot all the way across, and it pegged my Firefly, and then this Panther is going to probably finish the job here.
German target has been knocked out.
I sneak back into here to my trench before I get pinned.
What the hell? They've
Crucially though, you see that the enemies
faster.
Yeah, the enemy built 3 squads of flamer guys, and my guys don't even have time to get out of the trench before they get
Down
flamed to
50
death.
points.
The enemy's points are ticking down by 3 every couple seconds. So it's something they really need to deal with. In retaliation, I decide to call in artillery barrages on this area.
I say again, we are losing
So
a victory
quite a few guys get hit there.
point. Our victory is imminent.
My
Force the
Cromwell is also fighting them.
attack. NCO's reporting they have destroyed a German target.
But the enemy goes over here. They managed to decap this point, and they're trying to capture it. But really, they have to capture this middle point too, because they're only at 13 victory points now. So they have to capture the middle point as well. So they send their Panther in here. But I've got quite a few Pied guys, which are going to make it back out of there. For some reason, the enemy puts his flamer guys in this trench, and I call it Overwatch Artillery. This is why I say normally it's not that big of a deal if you build trenches and the enemy caps them, because normally it won't make sense for the enemy to capture the trench. Like if those flamer guys had ran over here right away, they might have been able to do something, but for some reason he decided to keep them in the trench. I have my Cromwell over here, which actually manages to get a few hits on the rear of this Panther.
NCO's reporting they have destroyed a German target.
And he runs out of victory points because I have 2, he has 1. And I think that would have been game either way. I do have quite a few units on the retreat, but I have more riflemen. I have more infantry sections coming up. I have infantry section in this trench. So I don't think he would have been able to cap this point, especially with this Cromwell here and another Firefly coming out. Yeah, that was a really close game. I thought I was going to lose, but I decided to stick with it. I chose Royal Artillery, which I think is a really underrated doctrine. I think Overwatch Artillery, as you see, is incredibly brutal. Walking Artillery, brutal as well. The only special ability I don't think you did see is counter battery fire, and I do actually have a game where 2v2 where I basically we win almost with a big help due to counter battery fire, which is when if enemy artillery shoots at you, your artillery automatically shoots back. But anyway, that was the British, and obviously my opponent made some mistakes, but I think that I managed to come out ahead, and thank you for watching, and have a nice day.